Hello everybody, and welcome to the Drydock, episode 222. This week the questions are taken from guide 263 on SMS Sankt Georg, that is of the Austro-Hungarian Navy, and the Wednesday video that went in that week as well, which was on Dreadnought modernization. So, let's get on to the questions. Glauber Glausger asks, were there any cruisers designed so badly that they ended up being worse than destroyers? It's a little difficult to quantify that, actually, although it sounds like a fairly simple question, because for the most part, as long as a cruiser stays vaguely upright and mobile, its sheer size is normally going to give it a number of advantages over destroyers, even if it doesn't necessarily have every advantage that perhaps it should do. So if it has some advantages and maybe some rather glaring weaknesses, does that make it worse than a destroyer? Not necessarily, and certainly not overall, but it could make it worse than a destroyer in terms of an overall investment in specific cases. It also depends on what kind of destroyer are you putting it up against, because, for example, one of the cruisers I do tend to go after a fair bit is the Duquesne class, the first French heavy cruisers, largely on the basis of the fact they basically have zero armour protection in any real way, shape or form, basically splinter protection only. And that means you've got this very large, very heavy, very expensive heavy cruiser, which if it ends up in a close range firefight has no protection against a destroyer that's maybe 1/6 to 1/8 its size and displacement, which is pretty bad. But for all those faults, a Duquesne can still sail further than a destroyer. It can still handle heavy seas for the most part better than a destroyer. And its firepower is considerably heavier than a destroyer in terms of single broadside weight. And of course, it can therefore engage targets that a destroyer normally couldn't hope to scratch, which would be, most other heavy cruisers, for example, as long as we're not talking about engaging with torpedoes. So the Duquesnes are superior to contemporary and later destroyers in some aspects, but not as superior as they should be because of the lack of armor protection. Then you get things like, as you can see here, the Capitani Romani class. Now, these were officially cruisers, although the Italians did also designate them as flotilla leaders, kind of like the Atlantas, but the Capitani Romanis are about half the displacement of an Atlanta. But then also, what destroyer are you comparing them against? Because they have 8 5 and a bit inch guns, as well as torpedoes and, again, kind of mostly splinter protection level of armour. But that would make them very heavily armed in the context of fighting most destroyers. They're insanely fast, 41 plus knots quite comfortably. So, they've got the speed actually on most destroyers as well. So they've got the speed, they've got some protection where most destroyers don't have any, and they've got firepower. But if you consider them in context, you put them up against, let's say, a Tribal or a Fletcher, then, the Capitani Romani holds most of the cards, assuming we're not discussing other things like radar and so forth. But if you put them up against the ships that they were designed to go up against, i.e. the last generation of French contre-torpilleurs, like the Mogadors can go toe-to-toe with them for firepower, both in rough caliber and in numbers of guns. The Mogadors actually have slightly more torpedoes, and the French contre-torpilleurs aren't exactly slow themselves. They're within shouting distance of the Capitani Romanis, and they're 1,000 tons lighter. So, whilst the Capitani Romanis might have been designed to fight French contre-torpilleurs, and indeed against older ones, like, say, the Le Fantascas, maybe they would have done okay. Against the contemporary design, even though Mogador is technically a year or two earlier than Capitani Romani, you're paying 1,000 extra tons for something that, even if it's got maybe a marginal advantage just in the fact it's got a slightly larger hull, therefore it can soak a little bit more firepower, it's not going to be walking away from a fight with a Mogador a lot of the time. So does that make it worse than a destroyer because you're paying more for a larger ship that's not really significantly more capable? Or is this just an artifact of the fact that perhaps the Capitani Romanis are in themselves a form of super destroyer and just slightly misclassified? So, well, opinions in the comments below. Josh Thomas Moore asks, we all know of some bad plans in military history, whether tactical or building, and you've given us some great examples in your videos, but could you give us the 5 plans, tactical or building, that made you go, what by Nelson's one good eye were they thinking? Now, when it comes to plans that make me go, oh, what? They tend to be the longer-term building and strategy plans, largely on the basis that when you have these kind of much longer-term plans, it's much easier, because you have a lot of time, to work out what the possible responses will be, what your economy can bear, and all sorts of things like that. So if you still at that point get things horribly wrong, it's much, much less forgivable than most tactical decisions, which tend to be made in the heat of the moment and usually with incomplete or incorrect information. And so yes, whilst those kinds of localized decision-making plans can go horribly wrong, it is also to a certain extent, in large part, forgivable. Not necessarily all the time, but a lot of the time, either because you'd just been outplayed by your enemy, so you had to make the best of a bad set of circumstances, or the information you were being provided was just flat out wrong, but you trusted it, or you had to trust it because maybe it was the only information you had to hand. So, for example, Forsaid gets a lot of criticism, and on a grander strategic level, a lot of that is rightly deserved. However, on the closer tactical level, when it comes to Admiral Phillips and his conduct and, taking Prince of Wales and Repulse out in the first place, then, as was hopefully seen in the video that I did on Forsaid, he was being fed a lot of incorrect information, which meant that in light of that information, his decision-making was sound. The problem wasn't with him, it was with the people who were giving him the wrong intel. And if he'd had the right intel, he almost certainly wouldn't have made those particular decisions. But if you want to look at tactical decisions, one of the ones I always come back to is Admiral Callahan's handling of his ships during his action with Hiei and Kirishima and friends at Guadalcanal. Not necessarily because of some of the wider issues, that's still quite up for debate, but specifically the fact that he chose to maintain his ships sailing in a column when, even in World War I, it had been shown that sailing in a column at night was a really good way to get chewed up if your opponent knew what they were doing at night, and by that point there was more than enough evidence that the Japanese did know what they were doing at night. And then you also have the extremely confusing last-minute orders that came out that kind of stymied, even with the column formation, it stymied what could have possibly been quite a nice American spoiling attack by causing massive amounts of confusion. So those are specific tactical decisions where, even for the fact that he was new to the theatre and maybe didn't know everything there was to know about fighting the Japanese at night, those particular elements of his decision were elements that anyone who was educated in night fighting at all, or had even bothered to read a book on night fighting, would have known and had been known for 20 plus years. In terms of a building one, you've got the French and their infrastructure in basically the entire first half of the 20th century. Now, lots of different nations made poor decisions with what to do with their naval infrastructure during this period, but the French consistently seem to come round to, our shipyards are too small. Okay, so we want to build a bigger battleship or carrier or whatever, therefore we need larger shipyards. Well, I know we're going to spend exactly the right amount of francs to build a shipyard that will fit exactly, or maybe only just, the new ship that we're building, and no more. And again, this is a kind of thing where you look back and go, well, what has the last, at that point, if you're talking maybe 1910s, 1920s, what has the last 50 to 70 years of shipbuilding told you? Each generation of new capital ship is going to be larger, so maybe you should just invest in the future a little bit and do one major expansion, and then you've got a lot more room. But no, you're going to end up doing 3 or 4 separate small expansions which cost an absolute fortune and end up restricting the size of ships you can build anyway. Then you have the thinking of most British major campaigns in the Caribbean when it comes to amphibious assault and then the subsequent naval supported warfare ashore during the Age of Sail, because the vast majority of those tend to consist of send in the first 10 to 20,000 men, then most of them are going to die from tropical diseases, and then we'll send in another 10 to 20,000 men, and then they'll die from tropical diseases, and we'll keep feeding men into this meat grinder, which isn't actually worth all these men's lives, because we think we can feed men in faster than they'll die of the hilariously rampant tropical diseases, and maybe, just maybe, they might last long enough to take a few pot shots at the enemy. Considering that British experience with just how lethal the Caribbean tropical diseases could be at the kind of point we're talking about had, been current knowledge for 200 to 300 years, they should really have come up with a somewhat better solution. Another one would be the Royal Navy's decisions around carriers in the immediate post-war environment, because you have the option to build a bunch of Audacious class, or, in my opinion, the even better option to, pause Audacious building at Ark Royal and Eagle and go back and revisit the Malta designs, think about it, and build, let's say, 4 effectively super carriers, i.e. midway equivalents, from the ground up with an angled flight deck. And that would give you a fairly nice force, maybe with 1 or 2 of the other more recent carrier designs you're bring down the line, to go forward into the second half of the 20th century and basically scrap almost everything else that precedes them, because a lot of them can't handle the newer aircraft, and even the ones that can are relatively small. But instead, someone in their infinite wisdom, whether it was the Treasury, the government, or the Royal Navy, decided no, it would be much more sane to maintain almost 24 carriers of 6 different classes, as I said, most of which couldn't handle the latest in strike aircraft and fighters, as opposed to half a dozen or so carriers of 2 classes, which would actually overall have had more aircraft available to them anyway and would have been far more modern. So yeah, whoever came up with that particular decision definitely needs their head examined. And I suppose if you want a tactical / strategic one that is appropriate to the exclamation around Nelson, you could probably look at Napoleon's iterations of various plans that he wanted to try and pull off to allow his invasion of England, because as you probably saw from part 3 of the Nelson video, some of those were so hideously complex I doubt they could have been properly pulled off if everybody had been using steamships, let alone if they were using sail-powered vessels subject to the weather, which is in fact what they were doing. BK Zhang asks, would you consider Operation Chariot to have been justified given the human cost and the fact that Tirpitz was never going to be stationed at Saint-Nazaire anyway? Now, obviously, Saint-Nazaire was a potential fallback port for a ship the size of Tirpitz if she'd been damaged while she was in Atlantic operations. So, overall, and again, this kind of links back a little bit to the previous question, based on the intel that was available at the time, Operation Chariot was justified. Because whilst there may have been a relatively low chance of Tirpitz being sent out on Atlantic operations on her own, given that, Bismarck had been sent out on Atlantic operations with Prince Eugen, and look at what just happened to her, as I highlighted when I did the video on Operation Chariot, Britain was actually in a worse off place to intercept a Bismarck-sized raider like Tirpitz in early 1942 than she was when Bismarck actually sailed. Because when Bismarck sailed, you had King George V, Prince of Wales, Hood, Renown, Repulse. Okay, those were your fast capital ships. You had 5 of them. Okay, Prince of Wales is brand new, and yes, Renown and Repulse are somewhat thinly armoured, but they can all bring heavy guns capable of hurting Bismarck. And then you have Nelson and Rodney and various other ships behind that, and obviously Nelson and Rodney having more than enough firepower and armour to deal with Bismarck if she can be slowed down or persuaded to fight. Now, fast forward to early 1942, and Prince of Wales and Repulse have been sunk, as has Hood. So of those original 5, you've got Renown and King George V. And the only fast capital ship that's come into play since then is Duke of York, which is near enough in almost the same condition that Prince of Wales was in May 1941. So you're down by, on balance, 2 fast capital ships, and that's not accounting for damage and repairs that have needed to be done to various ships, including Rodney and Nelson. So your ability to respond to a fast capital ship incursion in the North Atlantic with fast capital ships of your own is markedly reduced. Realistically, given the orders to not engage with anything that doesn't have a lot of armour, you're basically down to King George V. And against that, the expenditure of a few hundred lives potentially and 1 destroyer to completely rule out the chance that something like Bismarck is going to show up and potentially cause the loss of several thousand lives, the way that Bismarck had. On balance, it is pretty much justified. Of course, looking at it in hindsight, knowing what we know now about how the Germans were planning to use Tirpitz once she was fully worked up and commissioned, that might change things to us, but they didn't know that. Ben Arnold asks, were there any parallels between the notion of pre-dreadnaught armoured cruisers fighting in the line of battle and the reality of battlecruisers ending up in this role? If so, what does this say of the original concept? I don't think there was too many parallels in those circumstances other than big expensive thing we paid a lot of money for, better make most use of it as much as humanly possible. Because when you consider the lineup, why you bring armoured cruisers into a pre-dreadnought fight, it's either because you don't have enough pre-dreadnoughts and you just need basically hulls to fill in the lines, or you look at the fighting qualities of the armoured cruiser. And in the 1890s, there is something to recommend the armoured cruiser in a pre-dreadnought battle line, believe it or not. Partly it's because, guns are increasing in firepower quite a bit, and since range isn't increasing all that much, then even though we've moved on from compound armour to Harvey steel to Krupp steel, most battleships are still, to a certain extent, vulnerable to the main guns that can be found on armoured cruisers, at least at the medium, shall we say, ranges that 1890s battles were expecting to fight at, i.e. about 1,000 yards. And the smaller guns fire faster, so you can land more hits, and everyone's still expecting an awful lot of damage to be done by the secondary batteries, and the secondary batteries of armoured cruisers are often pretty much, if not exactly the same weapons as can be found on the pre-dreadnoughts, so, that's a fair bit to recommend them on that stage, and the armour of an armoured cruiser is enough to generally withstand critical hits from those same secondary batteries. And even if it's not strong enough to withstand a hit from a battleship's main battery guns, well, the battleship's incoming fire is coming in at a lesser rate, slower rate of fire than the armoured cruiser's own gunfire. And, well, as we just pointed out, there's a fair chance the battleship's just as vulnerable to your shells as you are to theirs. So all of these things, whilst, yes, the armoured cruiser can't per salvo do quite as much damage as a pre-dreadnought, it potentially has a role. But when you get to the 1910s and battle cruisers are engaging, then you have significantly more problems because the firepower of guns has gone up quite considerably. So, not just in terms of gun caliber, but also the 12-inch, say 35 or 40 caliber gun of the 1890s is a very different beast to the 12-inch 45 or 50 caliber gun of the 1910s. There's a lot more of them. The ranges have gone up quite significantly. Secondary batteries are now completely out of the question, and because the ranges have gone up significantly, despite the fact that guns have increased in firepower a fair bit, it's now possible for battleships to have a reasonable expectation of fighting at a range where their armour might provide a degree of protection. Battlecruisers, for the most part, there obviously being some exceptions, can't expect that level of protection out of most, if not all, of their armour. So it makes much less sense for a battlecruiser to be in a straight-up battle line role than it does for an armoured cruiser to be in a battle line role, because the battlecruiser is far more vulnerable. It's facing purely incoming heavy fire, so it's no longer got a rate of fire advantage. It's not got a durability against secondaries advantage, or parallel, because no one's using the secondaries in the main battle line anymore. Literally all it's got is its speed, but at long range the speed doesn't mean too much in terms of fire control the way that it did in the 1890s or even the early part of the 1900s. And so all you're left with is the fact that the battlecruiser has roughly the same kind of firepower in terms of gun size as a battleship, but overall it's a slightly smaller package of firepower, because they tend to be down one turret, in a slightly faster but far more vulnerable package than anything you'd have with an armoured cruiser. And of course, even with those battle cruisers that were specifically designed to stand in the line of battle, like, well, basically the Germans in terms of what was actually built, even then their armour protection is over a very tight area and still does have significant issues, because, you know, you look at the German dreadnoughts, that's what the Germans thought they needed to stand in a battle line, and the battlecruisers were as close as you could get to it. They weren't necessarily ideal. And again, this is one of the reasons why when people say, oh yes, well, you know, some German battlecruisers were just as well protected as British battleships. It's like, yes, on paper, if you look at the thickness of armour, now go and look at a armour scheme layout and tell me how much of the surface area of the ship's side is covered between those two ships, and then you'll realise the difference. Robert Santamaria asks, on the subject of the Big Five modernizations, given that the Colorado was roughly speaking a Tennessee with 16-inch guns, were the barbettes on the two classes the same size, or were they different? Presumably the modernization of the Tennessees to be Colorado-ish would require significant changes to the shell handling rooms, elevators and turrets, but would it require the barbettes to be ripped out? In theory, no, it wouldn't. The internal barbette diameter of the Colorados and the Tennessees is in fact exactly the same. It's 31 feet, which would suggest that you could, in theory, pull a triple 14-inch 50 caliber turret off and drop in a 16-inch 45 caliber twin, with all the aforementioned caveats that you mentioned about all the internals having to be gutted and redone. But, you know, you're not going to have to disassemble the barbette, in theory. The problem when it comes to modernizing the Tennessees to be Colorados, or Colorados in name, is that obviously you can only really do this once the treaty system starts to break down, because the treaty system forbids you from increasing the gun caliber on your battleships. And if you're doing that in the late 1930s or during World War II, you run into the problem that the Colorado's guns are no longer being manufactured, nor are their turrets. So the current US Navy guns at that point are either 16-inch 45s or 16-inch 50s as found on the North Carolina, South Dakota and Iowa classes. They're not the same as the Colorado's guns, and of course they're all in triple turrets, not twins. So you would, if you're going to modernize Tennessee and California, you would have to dig out the old plans, I guess, for the twin 16s, build them, and then maybe see if perhaps you could shoehorn in some 1645s off of the North Carolina or South Dakota spare parts bank to see if you could fit one in, or two, obviously, in a twin turret. And if you can't, well, you've fresh out of guns. And it would take a while to do as well. So by the time the Colorados and Tennessees were historically due their refits, basically during the Second World War, there effectively wasn't time. You might have been able to refit one of them to such a standard just in time for it to sail out to witness the surrender of Japan, and that's about it. Knight 6831 asks, given HMS Furious's 18-inch gun destroyed rivets, what sort of damage would Incomparable suffer if she fired her 20-inch guns? Now, I actually don't think she would have suffered too badly. Obviously, the pressure would have been somewhat higher, at the muzzle, but you've got to bear in mind a couple of things. One is that Furious, along with Courageous and Glorious, was built to light cruiser specification, so her hull, and therefore the rivets as well, were not built quite to the same spec as you would find on a battleship. But also you've got to bear in mind the caliber of the gun and its barrel length. So with Furious, her gun is a relatively short weapon. It's usually given as a 40 caliber weapon. Some sources say a 39 caliber weapon. But either way, now obviously these are not what you're actually going to get, because the gun itself is not seated directly over the ship's center line. It obviously is when the gun is centered fore and aft, but I'm talking about on a broadside. If you were to take, let's say, the ship's maximum beam, so on Furious that's 88 foot, so divide by 2 because the gun turret is roughly on the center line, so that's 44 foot. The gun is 60 foot long, so that means that the gun, assuming that it's fired at a 90-degree broadside over the beamiest part of the ship, which again it's not, because this is just for rough comparison purposes. As you can see, it's on a slightly narrower aft bit of the ship, but anyway, fired over the widest part of the ship would have the barrel 16 feet out over the side, assuming that it's fired, as I said, 90 degrees at zero elevation. Now, of course, if it's fired at a slight angle, let's say 45 degrees forward, 45 degrees back, or it's elevated, all of that's going to change that figure, but that's your kind of best case scenario. And as you will have hopefully remembered from the diagram of Iowa's gun muzzle blast and its various pressures, the high pressure stays ahead of the gun for quite a while, but it drops off quite significantly as you get closer and closer, further and further back. Now, when your maximum situation is 16 foot, there's not actually all that much to walk back before the pressure wave, is going to be high enough to do damage to the ship, regardless of how strongly it's built. Now, when you look at the 20-inch gun, there's not a huge amount of information about it, but let's assume that it's built to roughly the same specs as most other naval guns, so it's a 45 caliber weapon. Now, if you look at Incomparable's beam, maximum beam 104 foot, so that's 52 foot, and then you do your 20 inches multiplied by 45, divide through by 12 to get feet, and it turns out that in exactly the same situation, i.e. 90 degrees perpendicular to the ship's hull over the widest part of the ship, with the gun barrel at 0 degrees elevation, Incomparable's guns would be 23 feet past the side of the hull. Now, that might not sound like a huge difference. It is, after all, only, 7 foot? But, again, referring back to the Iowa's pressure wave charts, as per other videos, that 7 foot can make a huge amount of difference when you're talking about pressure behind the gun muzzle. And when you add into the fact that there's another 16 foot behind that 7 foot, 23 foot total, that's going to massively reduce the amount of pressure that's going to be hitting the ship every time the ship fires its guns. On top of, even accounting for the fact that obviously a 20-inch gun is going to have a bigger muzzle blast than an 18-inch gun. So Incomparable is less likely to take damage from a straight-up broadside, but also, given that you're starting out with the muzzle 23 foot away, you can rotate that through a fair arc before you're even getting to a point where you're the same distance away as Furious's gun would be in its best case scenario. So whilst you're firing directly ahead or directly aft might have been interesting, in the more normal engagement arcs, I don't think Incomparable would have actually suffered tremendously from the fire of her own guns. Emperor Dave asks, for increasing protection, would replacing the older armour plate with modern plate be a viable option? I seem to remember you saying there was an effective improvement for the same thickness of armour between World War I and World War II of about 10%. Unfortunately, there are a lot of variables and a few things that rule against the idea. In theory, in certain circumstances, in certain countries, it might work, because particularly in Germany and the UK, they did make some fairly big strides in the material that made up their armour. So if you look at, let's say, British armour plate for battleships manufactured in 1915 versus the same armour plate manufactured for battleships in 1940, then yes, thanks to introduction of various trace elements and so forth, the baseline material is considerably better. Exactly how much better, people still argue over. The only thing that's certain is that it is somewhat better, but figures that are given go anywhere from 3 to 5% all the way up to 25% and everything in between. So when I mentioned in a previous video that I kind of ballpark it at 10 to 12% or so, that's not necessarily because I personally believe that it is 10 to 12%, but it's an approximate middle ground of the various figures that are given. So to prevent accusations of bias one way or the other, it's a rough approximation. But even if we take that as at face value, so if you replaced, say, the 13-inch armour on a Queen Elizabeth class, it would then be the equivalent to 14.3 inches, in theory, all other things being equal, or maybe 14.5. If you replaced Hood's 12-inch armour, it would be equivalent to 13.25, 13.3 or something like that. Plus, of course, the effect of angling. But these kinds of increases, they don't buy you a huge amount. They do buy you some increased protection, but they don't buy you a huge amount compared to the cost. Bearing in mind that armour plate manufacturing, along with gun manufacturing, was one of the two big throttles on the construction of new capital ships, at least in the UK and in a lot of other places as well. So given that it's only Britain and Germany that make those big material advantage strides, and everybody else, while they're making some improvements, it's marginal, sort of low single-digit percentages. You look at the Germans, they don't have any World War One big capital ships to justify upgrading, so it basically comes down to should the British have done it, and for the British, as I said, armour plate manufacture was one of the big choke points on production of new ships, so they just physically could not produce enough armour to make it a viable thing, even if they wanted to do so. Now, okay, if it's 25% more effective, I go with the upper end of figures, then perhaps the argument looks a little bit better, because if you replace let's say again Hood's 12-inch armour, because that's an easy one, then that means Hood now has the equivalent of a 15-inch sloped plate, which hilariously enough would make Hood's sloped armour the second best protected capital ship on the planet, short of Yamato. But one, that's taking your best case estimate, and two, as I said, they just couldn't afford to manufacture all that additional armour plate anyway. So, and for the money and time, etc., there were better things to do. Drachith, no relation, asks, when talking about treaty-era cruisers, why build light cruisers at all? I assume it's a cost issue. Maybe you can get 5 light cruisers for the price of 3 heavies or something like that. Or B, light cruisers perform somewhat different roles than heavy cruisers. Could you elaborate? Now, the reasons for building light cruisers vary quite considerably, depending on the nation you're looking at, and also multiple nations had multiple different motivations at times. So if you look at the British, for example, one of the big motivations of building light cruisers was that a light cruiser, i.e. a ship armed with 6-inch guns, could be built significantly smaller. So hence you get things like the Arethuses and the Leanders. You were not going to be building an 8-inch armed cruiser with satisfactory performance characteristics on the displacement of an Arethusa class. If you look at, say, the US, one of their main motivations for building a 6-inch light cruisers was that, well, other people were building them, but also the 6-inch gun, in terms of its capability against the kind of armour you could put on a treaty-era cruiser, had now gotten to a point where it was looking like a viable weapon. And, of course, the 6-inch could be mounted in greater numbers and could, by, again, the 1930s, fire significantly faster. So you got things like the Brooklyns. And then you have the Japanese building the Megamis, and for them the main motivation of building light cruisers was simply that the London Naval Treaty had put a cap on the number and size of heavy cruisers. So if you well, the size cap had already been there from the Washington Treaty, but now there was a fixed number that you could build. So if you physically couldn't build any more heavy cruisers, then the only other option was to build lighter cruisers with 6-inch guns. And all of those factors in various ways, shapes and forms affected all of the navies that we just mentioned, plus others, just not necessarily all as the priority. So for the Japanese, the Megamis were pretty much always intended to be 8-inch. They didn't really worry about anything else too much. For the British and the Americans, capping out their number of heavy cruisers was also a factor. So they had to build light cruisers anyway. And obviously for the British, the performance of the 6-inch gun was a fairly heavily influencing factor, the same way that it had been for the Americans, but not as much as the fact you could get a lot of cruisers with 6-inch guns, in theory at least, for the same price and, more importantly, displacement as larger 8-inch cruisers. And for some other nations, there were things like the fact that a rapid-fire 6-inch gun was much, much better at dealing with destroyers, for example, or older light cruisers than a slower firing 8-inch gun, etc., etc., etc. So there's a whole range of different options that you can pick from, and for different navies, pretty much almost all those influencing factors are going to be there. It's just what order you rank them in and what priority they're given in a given navy. Daniel Morgan asks, I stumbled across a piece of British wartime propaganda involving the fictional J-class destroyer HMS Jovial. In the video, they claim they would be able to make steam in 4 hours from cold. Given that in the previous videos you've stated it could take days or even upwards of a week to raise steam in a capital ship, is this a bit of bending the truth, or could destroyers raise steam that quickly? Well, there's two factors involved in that. One of which is that obviously a destroyer's power plant tends to be a lot smaller and a lot more compact than a battleship's plant, so in theory it can warm up faster, doesn't take quite as long to bring online. Nonetheless, 4 hours from stone cold to fully pressurized, yeah, that ain't going to happen. Not in a World War II era steam plant, at least. Now, this is where the other factor comes in that what are they terming from cold? From a purely remote detached technical perspective, from cold would mean fires out, no fuel running, everything's wrapped up as if the ship's been in reserve or something. But, as I've mentioned in the past, there was the habit when a ship was alongside, and therefore could be described as cold, to still be ticking over a boiler or two, in the case of Nevada, when Pearl Harbor occurred, but, that was during a transition stage nonetheless, but usually to keep at least one boiler online, and potentially also, if it was in a wartime situation, maybe even keeping all of the boilers ticking over at a very, very low level. So in that kind of colloquial from cold, i.e. it's just alongside, with at least something running, then getting up enough steam to undertake basic manoeuvring in 4 hours from that condition, yeah, you could probably do that in a destroyer. Switch 374 asks, when Admiral Nelson as a midshipman went on the Arctic expedition, one of the ship's names was HMS Carcass. It seems a bit strange to name a ship after a dead body. Can you give us the background of the name? So Carcass was a bomb vessel, and bomb vessels were quite often desired by the Admiralty for Arctic expeditions because they were already very heavily strengthened ships to withstand the shock of firing heavy mortars. So it was thought, well, the hulls will be very good at withstanding the pressures of ice, which generally seemed to be the case. Now, Carcass was part of the Infernal class, and, well, the Royal Navy tended to name its bomb vessels, at least in the 1700s, after things commensurate with their purpose of throwing large amounts of incendiary and high explosive rounds at things. So the Infernal class included Infernal, Carcass, Terror, Basilisk, Blast, Mortar, and Thunderer, or Thunder, sorry. The preceding class had included Fire Drake, Mortar, Comet, Terror, and Serpent, and it kind of goes on like that. And of course, you'll recognise Terror there occurring twice because one of them had been lost, and these kinds of names recur. So this is not the HMS Terror of the Franklin expedition, but a predecessor. Now, as for why Carcass is in there, that's because it wasn't named after a dead body. It was named after the Carcass shot, which was an early form of incendiary, basically a form of hollow iron shot, obviously in a sphere or an oblong, with holes or slits in it so that you would have incendiary material inside. That incendiary material would be set off, and then when it landed, it would obviously land with the impact of a fairly heavy weight, and then it would have lots of incendiary fueled flames shooting out of the sides. So this Carcass shot, that was nicknamed after a dead body because some of the earliest forms of Carcass shot, back when it was developed in I think it was late 1500s, early 1600s, somewhere around that point, on land, some of them, people looked at them and went, oh, this cage looks a little bit like the ribs of a human skeleton or a carcass, therefore we will call it Carcass shot. By the time of its use in 1700s era Royal Navy bomb vessels, it looked more like a slightly too many holes bowling ball, but nonetheless, that was the origin of why Carcass was used for the shot, and then the ship was named after the shot, not directly after the dead thing. Smokey the Bear asks, in Peter Padfield's book Armada, one thing he stated was that English gunners had a high status on their ships compared to gunners on the Spanish ships. Do you know of other cases of this attitude, and did this difference also exist in other navies? So in terms of the sharper contrast that's present around the time of the Armada, the difference is mostly connected to how quickly the various navies are adopting the modern form of naval warfare, i.e. a primarily heavy cannon-based one, as opposed to the previous one broadside and board-based method. Social and political hierarchies after that in the Classic Age of Sail would also affect, to a certain degree, how gunners, which by that point made up of the majority of the common seamen, would be viewed in the future in various navies. But in the Elizabethan period, the late Tudor period, etc., when we're in this transition phase, aboard an English ship, the guns were the primary means by which a ship delivered damage to its opponents and the primary means by which it stayed alive, because unless it was an older ship that was still hanging around with very high forecastles and stern castles, a race-built English galleon or a small English raider, etc., it lived and it died by the strength of its gunnery, because it wasn't big enough and it didn't have the troop complement to go toe-to-toe with a big Spanish galleon and its massive troop complement in a boarding action. Therefore, the people who you rely on to stay alive and not in a Spanish prison cell or as a galley slave are obviously going to be viewed with a certain degree of regard and respect. Conversely, if you are in a Spanish vessel, whilst individual Spanish captains at the time were a little bit more up to date with the idea of gunnery, the broad scope of the Spanish Armada still viewed gunnery as an ancillary thing. So it was useful for fending off small, annoying attacking craft. It was very useful at smashing up galleys, as they were finding in the Mediterranean. But in a peer-to-peer, galleon-to-galleon combat, you would generally, in the Spanish Armada's case, fire a broadside, maybe two, and then they'd go in and board. And because there were a lot more troops aboard, and the troops possibly generally might come from lower aristocracy because they tend to be elites, and even if they didn't, then at least their commanders would come from the aristocracy and therefore viewed themselves as inherently superior anyway, then you had the gunners being somewhat looked down upon. Now, the weird thing is that siege gunners were an exceptionally skilled trade, and sometimes the guns on ships were effectively siege guns. So, for example, on a galleass or on a galley on either side of things, whether that be the various Western Mediterranean European states or the Ottomans, where you had a very small number of guns playing a much more central role in things, the gunners would command more respect. And, and back and forth it went, as I said, across different navies at the time, depending on how far along the tree they were in terms of adopting gunnery as the main decision maker, and also what kind of circumstances they were facing. Because, of course, in the Mediterranean, boarding was still a very important thing, but having an expert gunner in charge of one or two massive fixed axial guns on a galley was a very different thing to, 24 separate smaller guns scattered all around a galleon that also happened to have 400 heavily armoured troops. The Rogue Chief asks, about how long will it be before we can expect an HMS King Charles or King Charles III, and what type and class will she likely be? Well, it's probably going to be quite a good long while, because the Royal Navy did have a tradition of naming pretty much the first major capital ship that it built after the accession of a new monarch after that monarch, and that tradition held strong for quite a while. But as I've mentioned in previous Drydock, what you had was in the 1930s, when you had the latest in our various editions of King Edward's coming along, then what we now know as the King George V class the first one was going to be King Edward VIII. But then you had the abdication crisis, and King George VI stepped in, and by the time that the new battleship was going to be built, well, you now had King George VI in. But because there was still a lot of bad feeling and so forth going on with regards to the abdication and all the subsequent fallout of that, instead of choosing to have the new battleship named King George VI after himself, he decided, well, actually, I'm going to ask it to be named after my father, King George V, which is why the Royal Navy has two King George V class battleships in the first part of the 20th century. You have the 13.5-inch armed King George V's that were built in the 1910s after the accession of actual King George V, and then you have the King George V's, of the 1930s that were built at the request of King George VI, and that established a apparently new tradition whereby the Royal Navy now names a capital ship in honour of the previous monarch, albeit that it's only a tradition that's gone on for two monarchs. And it seems we also forgot how we define a capital ship and the whole thing of naming the first one we build, because obviously we had the entire reign of Queen Elizabeth II, and there was no King George VI commissioned during that time. Now, there is a King George VI due to be commissioned, one of the new Dreadnought class ballistic missile subs, but if the Royal Navy was sticking to the tradition previously just with one generation set back, then in theory probably the first of the R-class nuclear ballistic missile subs probably should have been King George VI. I mean, we haven't had any true carriers up until the more recent Queen Elizabeth class, but of course those were not named for Queen Elizabeth II. They were named after the battleship HMS Queen Elizabeth, which was named after Queen Elizabeth I. So it's going to be some years into the reign of Charles III before we get a King George VI in service, at which point another ship is going to, in theory again, have to be named Queen Elizabeth II during the reign of King Charles III. So again, assuming that the Royal Navy sticks with tradition and builds a ship large enough or powerful enough to be worthy of the name, then in theory we get Queen Elizabeth II at some point in the next 20 or 30 years. So a King Charles III we're probably not going to see until, it's the 2022 now, so probably until at least there's something like the 2050s or the 2060s, at which point who knows what it could be. It could be something like this. Or it could be, the rowboat that post-apocalyptic Britain has used to refound the Royal Navy. Dr. Irrelevant asks, there's something about the Battle of Jutland that's always confused me. During the run to the south, 5th Battle Squadron was initially left behind by the battlecruisers due to improper signalling, and later caught up to the battle. My understanding is that the Queen Elizabeths, whilst fast for contemporary battleships, were capable of 24 knots at best, whilst even the slowest of the battlecruisers involved could do 26. So how exactly was 5th Battle Squadron able to catch up to the battlecruisers? Basically, if you look at the ship's logs, the ships were not proceeding, the battlecruisers that is, were not proceeding at full speed. Seydlitz, for example, if you take her log as an example, because obviously she's the information with the first scouting group, she actually starts the engagement moving at 15 knots, and then orders are given to increase speed to 21 knots shortly after the main action with the battlecruisers commences. And then during the run to the south, after she's taken a few hits, orders are then given to increase speed to 22 knots, which is still slower than the QEs. And then shortly after that entry, they note the arrival of the QEs and them entering action. So the QEs are steaming full south. The top speed of the QEs on trials is theoretically somewhere in about 24.5 knots, give or take, depending on the ship. Obviously, in this case, they had opened up the taps, so they may or may not have been going even possibly slightly faster than that. And you've also got to bear in mind, if the ships have started their engagement at 15 knots, as Seydlitz has, it's going to take some time, even if they were aiming for full speed, to actually work up to that full speed. Whereas if the QEs have been going hell for leather trying to catch up with the battlecruiser fleet for a little while, they're much further ahead on that power curve. So if they start with a speed advantage that's significant, i.e. they're already heading at 24, 25-ish knots, and Seydlitz and company are starting at 15 and speeding up to 21, even if they then are thereafter order a speed increase in speed to full, the Queen Elizabeths are still going to have a speed advantage over them for quite a while, in the course of at least an hour or so, which is more than enough time for the run to the south. So yeah, that's basically why the QEs were moving full pelt whilst everybody else wasn't. And before anyone asks why, it's very simple. Look at what happens when you run a QE at speed, even in sea conditions, which, whilst described as rough, are not massively rough. It's rather difficult a lot of the time, if you're running the ship at absolute full speed, to get a decent fire solution unless you're running with the sea or the sea conditions are particularly favourable to you. So yeah, the QEs needed to take that risk to get close enough, but everybody else was steadying down to keep formation and get the best gunnery solutions that they could. Texas and La Choc asks, it seems actually getting up close with a battleship was something of a revelation for you. Were there any notions you'd built up from all the research that were dispelled upon actually seeing the thing in person? There were a few. So, for example, having been in, and I think I mentioned this in the video on Massachusetts, having been in Belfast's turret and knowing what the interior of Belfast turrets were like, I'd anticipated there being a little bit more room in a battleship's turret, because yes, the guns are bigger, but also the turret is that much bigger, the internal volume is that much more. So if it was laid out roughly like Belfast is, you've got your shell hoist and you've got your charge hoist and you've got your rammer and the gun, etc., there should be a fair amount of space. But as it turns out, actually, there is very little space inside even something as large as the turret of a battleship. So, it's one thing to look at plans and go, oh yeah, well, there's a rangefinder in there. It's another thing to turn up and find out, the rangefinder is this socking rate cylinder running across the width of the turret that's thick, much thicker than your entire torso, and occupies most of the volume that isn't occupied by gun. What else? The sheer proliferation of rangefinders and fire control sensors. Again, you read about the main radar and rangefinders, etc., on a ship, and then you read, oh yeah, well, and there's so many other secondary ones for secondary battery fire control, anti-aircraft fire control, etc., etc. And it's a number, but it's only when you're on the ship, when you look around and you suddenly start seeing various forms of direction and fire control all over the place, you realize just how many that actually is on a ship. And I think if I had to pick one other thing, then it's probably the sheer impact of the gunfire. But that's something for a video coming out next month, which you should hopefully see, which will elaborate on that further. So yeah, there were a lot of things that I think help put things in perspective when you're actually on a ship as opposed to just reading about them, and that's probably an edited highlight set. Colin Ware asks, in the opening scene of the recent movie version of Les Miserables, a veritable army of convicts is seen hauling a ship of the line into a dry dock. Short question, is this remotely possible? So the answer here is kind of yes and no. On the one hand, even if you're being relatively conservative, I count about 20 lines of men in the shot when you play it through, and there's somewhere between 50 and 100 men on each rope. So if we assume for a moment that the weight of the rope is negligible, which it isn't, in fact, there'll be some of those men will be putting their strength into actually just carrying the rope. But, if we, let's say, go with the lower end to account for that, and we say, okay, there's 100 men per rope, or let's say there's 50 men per rope, actually, that's the lower end, 50 men per rope hauling away, and there's 20 lines, so that's 1,000 men. So there's 1,000 men pulling this ship. In the brief pan over, we see it's a 3-deck ship of the line, which means, given that it's 1815 France, it's probably an Auchan-class ship of the line, which means it displaces somewhere around about 5,000, just over 5,000 tons. Now, initially, you might think, well, hang on a minute, 1,000 men, 5,000 tons, each man's got to move 5 tons. That's not going to happen. It can do. Anyone who's, worked at a marina or just moored a boat or whatever will know that a single person with a rope can gradually push or pull around a boat that weighs 5 tons or a little bit more than 5 tons in a water environment. So from a simple manpower perspective, and bear in mind we've gone with a lower end to account for additional men effectively just taking the weight of the ropes. There could be anything up to 2,000 or more in the scene. Obviously, there's not actually 2,000 men. I think there's a couple of hundred, and they CGI'd the rest in. But from a purely practical perspective of could somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 men with ropes pull a ship of the line? Yes, they could. Is the scenario as seen in Les Miserables in any way, shape or form plausible? No, it isn't, for 2 reasons. One, a ship of the line that is listing at that angle is not staying at that angle very long. That ship would be on its side and sinking pretty darn quickly. There's a few other things. One, the storm that's doing this, the size of the breakers that come in during the opening sequence. The people at the front there are probably not in particularly good shape. Probably haven't been swept out to sea. Thirdly, the people who are on the lower lines, as you can see, the lines are coming down to the men. Now, granted, there are a few men who are kind of standing up with their hands above their heads, gripping the lines. But if you've got 50 to 100 men on that line and they're putting any amount of force into it, the line's not going to just curve up and away like that from the point that they're holding it. That line's going to be a lot more taut if it's putting a lot of force into the ship, or people are going to be pinging up and down like bowstrings. So you want these lines to be a lot more horizontal before you try it. So the people higher up on the dry dock steps would be okay, but not the ones down here. Additionally, all these men at the bottom are in waist-high water, which is going to reduce their pulling strength because they're having to push themselves or back through the water. The water's providing resistance and so forth. And on top of that, you may have noticed one other rather major problem, which is if you look at the shape of the ship's hull, as you can see here, and kind of mentally extrapolate it down, you will notice this ship has considerably more draft than the 2 to 3 feet that's indicated by the fact the men here are standing on the bottom of the dry dock. So even ignoring everything else, assuming that they are somehow putting enough force to actually haul this thing forward against what appears to be quite a nasty storm, the best they're going to do is smash the ship's hull into the lip of the dry dock, because that ship is riding a lot lower than the base of the dry dock is for them to be standing in water that shallow. And yet, in the aftermath, when they're all being sort of led back into their cells, we see that somehow the ship has moved at least halfway into the dry dock, which, yeah, that's not a thing that's actually going to happen in this case. So, in broad terms, could 1,000 to 2,000 men haul an Ocean class ship of the line into Drydock? Sure. That would actually be relatively easy. But you'd have to be doing it in a filled Drydock with the men on the upper reaches of it and along the sides. As presented in the movie, although it's a very dramatic sequence, well, it's a very easy way to cost a French ship of the line, the French Navy ship of the line, if not for the fact that the ship's probably going to roll over and sink in a moment anyway. And so that brings us to the end of this week's Drydock. Thank you very much for listening, everybody, if indeed you still are. So, well, look forward to seeing you again in another video. And now it's time for me to go off and rest and prepare myself for recording the Patreon Drydock. Wish me luck.